everyone. We're expecting quite a few people, so it's going to take a little while here for everybody to gather, but we're delighted at the turnout. Welcome to everyone. We have about 29 people now. I suspect there's another 10 or 15 people who are going to join us at some point in the proceedings. We blocked off 2 hours. I don't know that this is going to be a 2-hour session. Maybe it'll be an hour and a half, although it does seem in the past when we've had these presentations and discussions that we end up having pretty interesting discussion that can go on in this format. It's wonderful to see lots of people that I know well and that have contributed to this project. So welcome to all of you. This is part of a regular block of time where we have a speaker series at the Division of Social and Transcultural Psychiatry at McGill. And the particular series varies from week to week under different rubrics, global mental health and culture and community mental health and so on. But this series is under the rubric of culture, mind, and brain. And we're going to be saying some words about that, about where that comes from and all the connections and the networks and people involved. And so that's the beginning of this is going to be giving you all some of that background and acknowledging the people who are here who've been involved with this book project that we'll be talking about, the co-editors, other members of the Culture, Mind, and Brain Network, some of the authors and contributors to the book. So we're going to take a little while at the beginning to sort of share some background to the book and some reflections on it from different people, and then I'll do a presentation on the first chapter of the book, which is co-written with two of the editors, with Carol Worthman and Shinobu Kitayama, who are also here with us. And they'll be saying something also at the beginning about their own contributions to the book and their own orientation. But I should also let you know from the get-go that one of our hopes is this is a first session in which we'll introduce the book as a whole. It coincides with the launch from Cambridge and on Amazon right now of the book, which is now available electronically. But we hope over the next few months that we're actually going to have many of the authors and contributors to the book who will do their own talks. That can then be used with the book in different ways for teaching purposes or just drawing attention to the work. And in particular, we're hoping that the different presentations will reflect a bit on, since the people finished their chapters, a year ago, sometimes even longer, it will be a chance for them to reflect a little bit on where they've come since the work that they laid out in their contribution to the book. And also we're hoping, and part of the point of having this talk today is to describe a little bit the framework of the book and then to see how different contributors relate to that in different ways in terms of how it's affected their own work or how they would want to challenge some things that we might be putting forward as a kind of fil conducteur, a kind of narrative thread through the structure of the book. So that's a little bit of our sort of shared agenda for today. I'm going to maybe I guess I won't switch to the slides because we're going to go around a little bit and give you some background to the book. And we have with us online all of the co-editors. So let me welcome them specifically. Carol Worthman at Emory, formerly at Emory, and Shinobu Kitayama at Michigan, Rob Lemelson at UCLA, and Connie Cummings in LA at the Foundation for Psychocultural Research. So you'll be hearing from each of them in a moment and have a chance to sort of hear their own takes on the book and their overall perspective and where they sit from a disciplinary perspective with respect to the book. And then we'll devote about 15-20 minutes, maybe half an hour to that, and then we'll have a presentation. I'll do a presentation on the first chapter in the book, and then hopefully all of you are able to stay with us, and we'll have a chance for some questions and comments and discussion at the end. So that's kind of our agenda. So let me turn it first over to Rob Lemelson, in his capacity, not so much as an editor, but as the founder of the Foundation for Psychocultural Research, because this book in some ways is kind of a capstone project or a way marker along a long trajectory that the FPR has been involved in. And we sketched that very briefly in the preface of the book. So I'm hoping Rob can say a few words about that, about the history of the FPR, and about where this project sits in relation to that, and anything else that he'd like to add. So turn it over to you, Rob.
Thanks, Laurence. Yeah, as Laurence just mentioned, this book is the capstone or culmination of a 20-year journey that started, well, a long time ago, but really in the late 90s. I was finishing my dissertation, and I was thinking about this intersection of biology and culture, which had been a long-term, obviously, interest in anthropology, leading to biological and biocultural approaches to anthropology. And one of my mentors was Robert Edgerton, who's was the grand old man, one of the two founders of the Department of Anthropology at UCLA. And Bob, his office was in the what's now the Lemelson Institute of Neuroscience. Back then it was a neuropsychiatric institute, and he was surrounded by psychiatrists and neuroscientists. So I think in that environment really cultured an interest of his in at least theorizing linkages, not just between biology and culture, but between the brain and emerging understandings in neurobiology and neuroscience of the intersection of culture and the brain. So based on that, and Bob was a pretty forward-looking guy, I got on board with that and organized a small research foundation that would bring together at the same table psychologists, anthropologists, neuroscientists, historians, psychiatrists, to engage in now a 2-decade-long process of analysis and reflection and integration and emerging ways of knowing about the brain, kind of reaching up from the brain and down from culture, and seeing that intersection on a whole range of topics. So I got together a board of the FPR, which are all colleagues of mine, professors at UCLA. I organize a staff, and actually I've been really blessed, as I say in the preface, to have the same board and the same staff for 20 years. So Irene and Mamie and Connie have been with us on this whole journey, as has Laurence and Carol and some other people here. And so we organized a number of early symposium that we brought together 20 or 30, 35 scholars to think about how to do this. And the result of that, there was if not unanimous, but a overriding interest in looking at the relationship between trauma and social violence and the brain and culture. And on the basis of that, we decided on a multi-pronged approach. One was organizing conferences and convening. So the first conference in 2002, we had planned it before the September 11th tragedy, but it came to fruition after, so it was very timely. And I'm sorry to say, it was the right choice at the time. It turns out in retrospect not to be the right choice, and people can boo and hiss if you want. Our major speaker was Rudolph Giuliani. So he had just come off as like America's top mayor, and he seemed like the right person to deal with the trauma issue. So I don't regret that decision. And in fact, he brought several of the people at the trauma conference who had been involved in the 9/11 relief efforts and trauma care efforts. Rosemary O'Keefe, who was the head of the Mayor's Office of Victim Assistance, and Rishi Shiro, who is the head of emergency management in New York. So it was actually a really great conference. But we were kind of still getting steady on our feet, and we experimented in each of the preceding conferences with different forms. The first one was something that I wouldn't necessarily recommend in terms of interdisciplinarity, is that we had separate sessions on neuroscience and anthropology. And what would happen is in the neuroscience section. Some of the anthropologists would stay, but not many. And for most of them, but not all, the discussion was at a level in terms of the guild of neuroscience that most anthropologists, I don't think, got everything. And similarly, I'd say more neuroscientists left the room when the anthropologists spoke. So that was the last time we used that structure of having these disciplinary seminars or symposiums. After that, we always tried to do things in different ways in an interdisciplinary way. And that led to a series of conferences, one on emotion. They have different titles. You can go to our fpr.org page, to the FPR, thefpr.org, to look, to see the different conferences. But just for simplicity's sake, it was culture, the brain, and emotion, and child development, and mental illness, and gender and sexuality. And then our final one was going back to the roots in 2016 or 2016, I think, on culture, mind, and brain, that resulted in this in this volume that we're all excited to see published. At the same time, we tried a number of educational experiments. So we did postdocs and a requirement of receiving
unknown caller.
Sorry. The requirements of for the postdocs is people, grounded in a discipline, but a strong interest in interdisciplinary work. And we also organized a program at UCLA, a graduate program in culture, brain, and development. And that lasted for 10 years. That was a joint program in anthropology, psychiatry, anthropology, psychology, neuroscience, education, and linguistics. And that was an interdisciplinary program where there was a training program and a weekly seminar and lecture series, and that lasted for about 10 years. As a result of an evaluation of that program, we moved towards integrating a psychiatric element and psychiatric faculty. And so we kind of turned that program into a program called Culture, Brain Development, and Mental Health. And that was based on more of a fieldwork model and really trying to get neuroscientists into the field. And so we had 3 field sites, one in India on autism, one that Laurence was involved with in Nepal and Singapore on trauma and post-traumatic stress disorders, and one in Mexico on psychosis. And that program lasted for about 6 years, trained a number of graduate students. And at the same time, we had an ongoing, I think for 15 years, a program at Hampshire College, which is my alma mater in culture, brain, and development. It was oriented towards undergraduate, obviously, but linked up with the graduate programs. And then after a series of seminars a number of years ago, after going through the culture, brain, and development program and doing all these convenings and conferences, we organized another gathering of scholars. And the unanimous consensus was we should develop, a la kind of the MacArthur Foundation, research networks, small, tight, insular in some ways, but collaborative research networks. And that's where we're in the second year, towards the end of the second year of a culture, mind, and brain, a research network with some of the people in the Zoom meeting. I think that's all about, I'll say, Laurence. I don't know if you wanted me to talk about anything else, but that's the FPR, and that's the origin of this volume. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Rob. I think that's a great introduction, just sort of sketching the arc of where we're at. We're going to come back to you in a few minutes as one of the co-editors to ask you to talk just a little bit about your disciplinary perspective, because that's one of the aspirations of the FPR has been to really get these very different theoretical and methodological kind of positions, genuinely talking to each other, not walking out of the room and not scratching their head, but engaging in some kind of really meaningful dialogue. So, and you know, speaking as somebody who, as you say, has participated from the early stages, I do think that a significant amount of that has gone on. That hasn't just been hand waving, but has been very meaningful exchange. And in fact, that the whole field or fields that we're talking about that this touches on have all moved forward very substantially over this period of time. And certainly the FPR program has played a role in all of that. I guess I wanted to turn to Carol now in her capacity as the sort of scientific director or whatever of the, I'm not sure, I keep forgetting the exact precise title of this Culture, Mind, and Brain Network. And maybe you can talk about that, and then you can segue perhaps to your role as editor in this particular volume.
Well, thanks, Laurence. And it's a pleasure to see a number of you whom I know already and a bunch of you I don't. And I really admire the community you have there at McGill. Not everyone that here today is at McGill, but it's a great group. So thanks for being there. Actually, I should point out that the network is run by both Connie Cummings and me, because networks require a lot of logistics. And Connie is not only a superb interdisciplinarian as a linguist herself, but also really good at logistics. And so that was one of the ideas of the network, is to deal with some of the logistics, small amounts of funding, conduits for ideas, organizing materials, helping people engage with fast-moving events. And this is something that a foundation with staff availability can provide, unlike the funders that we may get our major funding from, like NIH. It's like goodbye and good luck if you're funded by them. And the network has been really interesting because of the time that it has occurred, that the first year we were kind of, okay, business as usual, people figuring things out. And then COVID hit, and like everyone else, we've been busy inventing other ways to do science and communicate that science. And I think are really energized around that. And we have a current wave of internal project proposals that are aiming at that area. So it'll be interesting to see what comes out. And I think everyone in the group, oh, and another thing that's really cool about this, I think many networks try to do this, not all succeed, and that is to have senior scholars and junior scholars, late career and early career and everything in between, to really provide both a conduit of ideas, but also mentorship and access to resources and social capital that senior can provide. So that's a bit about our network.
Great, thank you. I'm going to show some slides afterward, and you'll see the URL for the network if you want to sort of, you know, go visit on the web and get a bit of a picture of what's going on and so on. But this is really, sorry, Carol, please.
Yeah, this is a really good point. One of the things that we've been doing, and it's really Connie who's doing a lot of this, is members are sharing in resources. So for example, in terms of pedagogy and best practices and how do we do all this remote learning, also a lot of literature around diversity and representation and the current struggles to deal with marginalization, et cetera. And so you'll find a lot of resources there that are meant for everyone. So please check it out if you're interested.
Yes, and you yourself are in the process of becoming a resource. We're filming this or recording this this discussion, and we'll edit it at the end. And certainly, if generally we probably wouldn't include any of the individual people other than the formal presenters. But if there's something that comes up with that is great, we'll let you know and see if you're willing to be included in that format. But the idea is to end up with something that we can post to that website, into our website at McGill, and to have these videos, these Zoom talks available as a resource going forward. And so that both for the network in general and for this particular book project, there would be that sort of visual complement to all the text work that we're doing. So I don't know. I don't know if Connie, do you want to say anything about the network per se at this point? Is there anything to add from that
I
point?
think Carol's done a great job. Do you want me to say something about the books? Do you and Rob want me to say
The
anything?
other books,
Yeah.
sure. I have a slide showing them,
Oh, okay.
and maybe when I put that up, then
Yeah, then we can
you'll
talk
speak
about
up, and I'll try to remember to ask you to speak up. But if I don't, please,
Sure.
unmute yourself and intervene at that point, because I think
Okay.
you have a story to tell about those. So what I want to do then is, this is by way, then we're sort of, working our way toward the specific focus today. And by way of carrying it forward then is to ask each of us, there are five editors, each of us to say a few words about our own disciplinary orientation and how it plays out in the context of this book. And again, I'll be putting slides up soon. I'll show you the table of contents and so on. But the overall raison d'etre of the FPR has been to try to create this interdisciplinary space where something can happen that really is more than the sum of its parts. That's really emerging from this kind of dialogue in a way where, because of the facilitation that's gone on, a deeper, more intense and more creative dialogue can occur. So it's not just parallel play. And I think it's been an ongoing struggle, challenge, moments of epiphany and moments of frustration. But I think there have been some very interesting things that have happened. And the gestation of this book actually began, aside from the conference, with a series of meetings and long discussions among the co-editors about this interdisciplinary vision and how it might play out. And the last chapter of the book, in fact, as you'll see later, is kind of epilogue, is on interdisciplinarity. And in fact, the last chapter of the first book on trauma also had a chapter on interdisciplinarity and some of the challenges. So those define 2 points in a kind of arc where we can maybe get a bit of a sense of how have we come, at least within our own community, how far have we come, and what are the unresolved challenges. So maybe I'll put myself at the end. I'll say a few words about my own orientation, but we'll go back over maybe in the order of the people listed on the title. So I come back to Carol now to ask for just a few reflections from how you define yourself in a disciplinary or interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary way, and how that reflects on how you come to the issues in the book.
Yeah, well, officially, I'm a biological anthropologist with undergraduate degrees in biology and botany. And I discovered people late in my undergraduate career and was startled to find the severe mind-body split that was out there in the history of Western philosophy, which I totally didn't buy. So I thought, oh, cool, I'll go to grad school and study that intersection between mind and body. And hadn't realized at the time that that would be a tough row to hoe in many ways, but certainly more interesting. And so for that, the FPR and folks who are involved in the FPR and scholars adjacent have really been a congenial home for that. By now, I count myself as a medical anthropologist, a psychological anthropologist, and a human biologist, and do a lot of work in global mental health. The last thing I would say actually is that several people asked me, and I asked myself, we asked ourselves, why do a book at this point? And, sort of like, well, books are passé. And a lot of cool, interesting work is going on online and ways to bring ideas together. But I think it's actually interesting to have a book where readers are presented with other people's curation of a certain arena. You may not agree with that, in fact, hopefully resist or look for the missing parts and push back. But a great thing about a book is that. And another one is that I still think that a book provides a sort of intellectually supervised is not quite the right word, but curated, I guess is the word, way of people sharing extended ideas and really pursuing those ideas with examples, holding their fingers to the fire of what they really mean by stuff. Journal articles don't let us do that. And blogs are kind of a different beast. Verbal performances also are different. So I, for one, cherished the opportunity to work on this book. As Laurence said, I think it had its brilliant moments and its frustrating moments. And I think we'll all see some of the gaps, and I'll just name one of those actually, which is we had an incredibly hard time getting mainline neuroscientists to participate, not because they weren't interested. So when you look at the table of contents, you'll notice it's not that they weren't interested, they were so busy writing grants, and ever more so, and being able to continue to fuel their science, that books are considered a distraction, however interested they may be. So this kind of online forum, let's hope maybe we can pull them in for discussions and engagement in ways that are easier to fit in between grant writing and article writing.
Thank you. Thank you. You know, you're underscoring a couple of very interesting issues that I'm sure we're going to return to as we talk about the interdisciplinarity specifically, and maybe come back at the end and have the kind of colloquy that we continue, the kind of colloquy that we had around this. But one of the comments of some neuroscientists, again, was the problem with a book is the temporality of a book, you know, the slow pace of bringing everything together and finally having it appear in print is so out of sync with the production of knowledge and with the reward systems and with the, you know, the whole process, that it didn't make sense to them. I share, though, and probably have even more deeply invested in the idea of a book as a place, as a space, as a kind of object that brings together things in a way that would not happen. And I know that the morsalization of my own consciousness that goes on by Googling around and finding the answers to everything in some kind of superficial way. And it's quite different than the labor involved in bringing these, you know, big bodies of work together in some kind of apposition. So I'm still personally very invested in and surrounded by, I've got a backdrop here of this from the cover of our book, which is actually, maybe we'll ask Rob to say something about this in a moment, or before we launch into things after. But behind me, in reality, is just books overflowing off the shelves. So I just want to join that company, you know. Anyway, so let me turn to Shinobu maybe for a similar kind of moment of reflection. So.
Okay, so hi everybody. It's wonderful to be here. I prepared a short PowerPoint. So if I could share my screen.
Okay, good. Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, do you see my screen?
Yes, and it's worth it. It was worth waiting for, to have the Yosemite view. That's great.
Oh, okay, that's great. So let's start. Do you see it?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so it was a great experience to work with 4 wonderful colleagues, you know, Laurence, Carol, Connie, and Rob, and on this book project. And the book is just an excellent collection of very different perspectives, and I really enjoyed and honored to be part of it. So in our chapter, we discussed our own perspective in some detail, with an emphasis on recent theorizing about how culture might be embrained, and then reviewed the evidence for that theorizing. So today I want to outline this perspective quickly. So I'm a psychologist, and I see various psychological functions and experience, say including self, cognition, emotion, and motivation, as guided and driven by the brain. Culture has profound influences on those psychological functions or experiences, since it influences, and in some fundamental way, it shapes the brain. How does this cultural shaping of the brain happen? Here's a conceptual model we proposed recently. As you can see, the brain engages with culture from the very beginning of life, throughout the lifespan, without any breaks whatsoever, at least during waking hours. The brain acts in some way. If the behavior goes well, the brain receives positive feedback. Such feedback will not happen if the behavior is inappropriate. Positive feedback will then strengthen the connections of the neurons that are recruited to perform the behavior. When this reinforcement accumulates over time, there will emerge systematic structural variations in the brain. We now know that such plastic changes of the brain happen as a result of years of experience in driving a cab in a complex city like London, training in juggling, and many years of practice in a musical instrument like piano. And now the question is whether analogous changes may occur due to living in different ecologies and institutions, which are often organized by different models of the self, such as independence and interdependence. So today I want to point out just one important implication of this line of thinking. At the highest level of abstraction, we can surely analyze culture by referring to a very simplified mandate, such as independence and interdependence. However, reflecting various geographic, ecological, economic, and historical factors, these mandates can be instantiated in many different tasks. For example, in the United States, there's a great value placed on independence of the self. However, this value or mandate is instantiated in many different tasks, such as becoming financially independent, expressing the self, being unique, and maybe being argumentative. In the process of socialization, each individual, each of us will pick up some select set of such tasks and use them as a means for engaging in the culture and becoming a member of good standing, hopefully, in it. Gradually, we will acquire psychological tendencies which are required to perform the tasks that have been adapted. So for example, just consider Steve. He adapted for him the first task, financial independence, as his thing and the basis of his identity. He works hard on it, and eventually he may have honed his analytic thinking and maybe strategies of, say, seeking self-sufficiency. How about Sarah? Sarah may pride herself of uniqueness. She may well become very good in looking for positive information about herself in memory. In both cases, neuroplasticity is the underlying mechanism of the forming of new psychological tendencies. Now, in this framework, culture can be seen as quite simple at the level of mandate, but its manifestation becomes extremely idiosyncratic and ideographic at the level of each individual. So both Steve and Sarah, I noted earlier, are equally independent, but how they are independent could be very different. Steve took pride in his financial independence, and Sarah had a very unique personality, for example. So, and she shows it. She shows her independence that way. So all these individuals are unique, like Chinese ideographs. So psychological tendencies of each individual do not necessarily represent the entirety of the culture. But when Steve, Sarah, and everybody else are combined and in some way aggregated, the effect of culture on psychology in its entirety may begin to emerge. Also, it is very important to note that each individual is defined by a bundle of psychological tendencies which are shaped through the engagement in some select set of cultural tasks. These psychological tendencies are embrained, automatized, or becoming autonomous in some important way. As a whole, they constitute the agency or the self. And this leads me to my last point, which concerns the dialectic between culture and agency. In his very memorable statement, French philosopher and anthropologist Pierre Bourdieu observed that agency or habitus in his terminology amounts to this: systems of durable, transposable dispositions that function as structures which generate and organize practices and representations of culture. the same idea is echoed in the writing of British sociologist Anthony Giddens in his structuration theory. And anthropologists in Chicago, Rick Schrader, also noted that culture and the psyche make each other up. And inheriting the same spirit, Hazel Marcus and I have insisted that the culture and the self are mutually constituted. Well, this picture is lovely. This is several decades ago. So in any case, I think my presentation today, what it might be adding, hopefully, to all this is the possibility that these three elements are required to establish this culturally shaped shaper of culture. First of all, people must actively engage in culture through cultural tasks. Second, reinforcement from the cultural milieu must be organized by practices and meanings of the place. And third, neuroplasticity of our brain responds flexibly to shape up our brain. Once these three conditions have been met, the brain is shaped by culture, and the brain that's shaped will become the autonomous agent who eventually shapes the culture from which it has been derived. So there's a very good reason why Bourdieu's sentence is impossibly long and recursive. So anyway, so this is a basic theme of my chapter. And in my talk in November, I really look forward to elaborate on some details. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Shinobu. We can maybe switch back. And so you'll hear, again, as the rest of us talk today, and as I outline the first chapter, how resonant all of this work is with the things that Shinobu's been outlining in a kind of new cross-cultural psychology that moves really far away from the sort of stereotyping of different cultural groups and much more down to the fine-grained level of how people are participating in cultural worlds and developing their own unique version, if you will, of things that can be described, nevertheless, in some kind of at some kind of collective level. So I want to turn then to Rob, if you want to say a few words. Sorry, catching you in between, but to say a few words again, but this time from the perspective of a scholar, of an anthropologist, psychological anthropologist, visual anthropologist. You'll have again, like each of us have a chance later on in the series of talks over the next few months to present your own chapter in the book in depth, but more from the point of view of the overall kind of interplay of different perspectives, and anything you'd like to say about that in this particular book.
So even though I've helped found this foundation that integrates or attempts to look at the interconnections between the brain and culture, I haven't actually engaged with the neuroscience part of it very much in my career, other than when I was doing my dissertation on neuropsychiatric disorders in Indonesia. I had gotten a grant to look at obsessive compulsive disorder and Tourette syndrome following the PANDAS hypothesis. I don't need to get into that. And I wrote a chapter where I engaged as almost kind of a layman's perspective on the neuroscientific basis, foundations of neuropsychiatric illness. But subsequent to that, I started filming my work during that period in the mid-90s, and I never really turned back. I ended up doing engaging in a career of storytelling in many ways. I've done, 15 or so different films and associated book chapters and journal articles and study guides, and now I'm looking at this integrative ways to integrate the visual and the psychological. And I think one takeaway message from that, and so I ended up writing my chapter in the book on storytelling from a cultural perspective, but also how what we know from the kind of neurobiology of storytelling, how storytelling gets into the brain, and the kind of neural mechanisms involved in perceiving and interpreting and finding meaning in a range of forms of storytelling. So I think the takeaway message for myself is and this is certainly also as a result of 20 years at the FPR, it's really pretty hard to do interdisciplinary work unless you're really deeply committed to making that a central part of your career. You can, dabble in it. It's almost like a dilettantish dabbling in neuroscience from an anthropologist, or I think on the neuroscience side, you can have a very incomplete understanding of what culture is and how it affects neural functioning. But to actually engage in the research where you're looking at those two, and we've looked for decades now at the FPR, and there are fellow travelers who do this, and some of them are in this room, but it's not easy. It's not easy to do a competent job in one discipline and then reach across and do a competent job that would be recognized as competence by core people in that discipline. So it's a tough task, but I think we can look towards at least a theoretical engagement and an appreciation of diverse models and ways of knowing while maintaining our disciplinary focus in our own fields. Yes, I think that's about it, Laurence.
Great, thank you. Okay, Connie, do you want to say a few words? I mean, you have functioned and worn many different hats in this process, and with your own disciplinary background, as Carol mentioned, in linguistics, but also as someone who has been really aware of a lot that's going on and brought a lot into this discussion repeatedly for all of us. I wonder if you can give us your sort of some thoughts on the process.
Sure. Well, in terms of my background, all you have to know is that theoretical linguistics, I'm sort of in the Chomsky, grew up under the Chomsky rule. So he hypothesized the language faculty in the brain. So I have a natural affinity for brain, and I think that's my bias. And the second thing is that, I was, a theoretical linguist is really a kind of nerd. I could explain my dissertation to you on a cocktail napkin. It's text, it's all about diagrams. So I'd never taken an anthropology course in my life before I joined the FPR. And so it was kind of a shock and fascinating to be introduced to these all these different areas, and I think that the other thing to know is just that I spent so much my entire life studying Greek and Latin and French and Italian. I studied Sanskrit. My dissertation was on Yoruba, an African tonal language, and I just loved every single one. So I think being used to all these different languages and this sort of level of complexity at our linguistic conferences. Usually most people are native speakers. They come from all over the world. They're all nerds like me, and they just want to talk about what your language does and mine doesn't. So I think in a weird way, I was very well prepared for my job, which eventually really became managing editor of the volumes, and really appreciating, as again, the language of all these different disciplines and trying to, make sense of it. And it's just been a joy. So thanks.
Well, thank you. And I want to acknowledge just how not only, the traces of your work and of your thinking and imagery and suggestions are throughout the text. And we just shared today the little thing about the Shakespearean marriage at the very end of the book, which comes directly from your suggestions about how we might find a way to end the book in a suitably grand and humanistic tone, kind of. So, and we now feel very, given how the world's going, we feel very happy that we managed to do that one little bit of affirmation as well. So, yeah. Okay, well, let me say just a couple of words about my own perspective, and then I'm going to segue into showing you a little bit more about the book and some slides, and then do a sketch of the first chapter. You've already heard some of that from Carol and from Shinobu, and I'll just sketch a bit more of it to set the stage really for talks that you'll be hearing, who we hope you'll all attend later in the year. Next week, Carol will be speaking, and in a few weeks, Shinobu, and then over the next 6 months or so, we'll try to get in as many of the authors as we can, and we'll see where we go in the future to try to produce this corpus of talks related to the book. But my own background, I guess formally now I do cultural psychiatry. And that involves a very zigzag kind of intellectual trajectory, starting off in physics and then in psychology. And in psychology at McGill, I was there at the time when Dio Heb was there. So that's a very important figure also in terms of bridging neuroscience and psychology, because the idea of Hebbian learning become a mainstay within a lot of sort of AI theory and neural network theory and so on. But having gone to medical school, and then the last year, and knowing I was going to do psychiatry, and then the last year of medical school, Margaret Locke, who's here with us today. So this is very, it's going to turn into a kind of emotional event in some ways. Margaret came to McGill to teach, and we had the great fortune in our curriculum at that time to be able to go back to the classroom, essentially, back to basics, I think they called it, in the last year of medical school. So after people were very involved with doing practical clinical things and all excited about the apprenticeship, we got to go back and reflect on things. And Margaret gave this very concentrated course, a month-long course in essentially what I guess it was called ethnopsychiatry or something like that at the time. So it was very much an introduction to medical anthropology and to psychiatric anthropology. And for me, it was very clear at that moment, this is what I want to do. This puts all the different pieces that interest me together. And then again, there are more zigzags I won't describe right now. I just had to tell at least that piece of the story because I'm sitting here looking at Margaret as I speak. So, what's happened for me is the undergraduate work that I did in psychology was actually in physiological psychology, is with Ron Melzack and Norman White. And so for me, this sort of turn to the brain that started a little bit with the FPR for me was returning to an unfinished thing in my own background, and the possibility of putting together the things that I'd come to be really fascinated by in terms of everyday life and the way people live and the sort of embodied and social nature of human existence, and putting that back into some kind of dialogue with what we are learning about the brain. So that's this whole process for me has been immensely rewarding and really helped to weave together parts of my life that otherwise would have been chapters that were not necessarily linked, that were just sort of moving on to the next thing. And I feel I have this sense, and probably goes with phase of life too, of sort of coming full circle and all these things fitting together in different ways. And in particular, because having those spaces where these things can really come into conversation with each other, as we're trying to do at McGill, I think with some success, is really for me bringing together different facets of my own interests, but also of the phenomena we're trying to understand and trying to respond to clinically and in terms of rethinking our lives. So anyway, all of this to say, we'll come back to this, I think, at the end of the series of talks when we have a session on interdisciplinarity. But it's very meaningful. I have to say, the first meeting that I got invited to, when Rob sent, the foundation sent this letter inviting people to Ojai, California, to this gorgeous resort in the place where they shot the film Lost Horizons or whatever, right? But it's literally Shangri-La. And I remember showing it to my wife saying, my ship has come in. Getting this letter was like, yes, it's all going to happen. And I thought that was a little bit of a fantasy, but it's turned out to be true. It's turned out to be very much a way to have a kind of very intense discussion and engagement with things that otherwise, I think, as Rob was just saying, I mean, academia is still very, very disciplinary, and it's very easy to be perceived as a dilettante and an interloper. And I think the FPR for me has really succeeded in making a space where there can be these productive conversations that really move across boundaries. So that's my little, little bit of history here. So I'm going to switch now to sharing screens and show you a few slides. I'll be a bit sort of going back over what we said just very quickly in terms of some of these images. And then I'll do a little bit of a summary of the first chapter in the book. I think what I want to do, I guess that'll work. Everyone can see my screen now that says Division of Social and Transcultural Psychiatry. And so this is just the context that we're working in of a program that is devoted to trying to ensure that social and cultural processes and contexts are included in psychiatric thinking and training and practice, which I have to say sometimes is an uphill battle. because of a presumption. The old presumption was everything we need to know we can find in human psychology, and maybe psychoanalysis gives us already an adequate story of that. The newer version is everything we need to know can be found in the brain, and neuroscience, and in particular reductive neuroscience that looks at molecules and synapses or maybe up to circuits will be sufficient to give us that account. And so we've been pushing back against that all along, saying there's got to be more to this, that because human beings are constituted not only by their brains, but by their bodies and by their social worlds, and all of those have to be given proper space. So that's the overall context. And within that division, we've had this program, Culture, Mind, and Brain program, that the FPR has been very generous in giving us some support for. And it's really been a way to bring together a small group of people who share this commitment to sort of speak across disciplines and find ways to do interesting collaborative work. The FPR supported us in different ways, initially to include psychiatry in the broader vision of culture, mind, and brain, and more recently just to kind of become a node in this network that you've heard a little bit about. And this is a picture from our summer school a couple of years ago, and actually when I look around I realize that several of the people on this call are there sitting at tables in Thompson House talking among themselves along with students from that year. And if you go to the FPR site, which is thefpr.org. You can find out more about all the activities that are going on there, and a plug for the book that we'll be talking about today, as well as the many other universities and programs that are linked together through the networking activities of the FPR. And that's really this new phase that we're in now of trying to use this network to build collaborations, to give particular opportunities for students, and to keep energizing this interdisciplinary dialogue. It was already mentioned, I think, that there have been several books from these previous conferences. Not every conference has resulted in a book, but these are the previous ones. And I know, Connie, is there anything specific you'd like to say? I did remember about this and about the books.
You know, I don't think so, Laurence. I was going to say something about sort of the general framework of how we thought about the brain for each of the books and the sort of evolution, but you may be doing that later.
No, you feel free. Now's the time, because there were, in the context of doing these books, there were discussions of many different formats. It's related to what Rob talked about earlier about the, how to get people in dialogue in some ways. Is it just, different silos that are side by side, or is there good, meaningful exchange? And it was the same issue in discussing the architecture of these books, kind of. And I think thinking about that has evolved or maybe gone back to square one at times. But if you want to say a few words about that, I think it'd be very interesting.
Yeah, I think just beginning with understanding trauma. I mean, we had some of the most amazing neuroscientists, Mark Bowden, Michael Fenso, Mike Davis, and I think, though, as Rob said, they were just like they were totally freaking out about being at the conference. And I think at the time it was fear circuitry and extinction that was their focus. So, and then I think, so they were definitely, the only, I just want to say that the only person I think at the conference, Michael Meany, in 2002, really started to talk about epigenetics and looking at grooming and I think DNA methylation, and I think that really carried over to the next. So basically, the next book, Formative Experiences, took that idea and really developed it, and so it was sort of the brain framework by the time of, I guess, 2010 when it came out was sort of epigenetics and the stress model. And then I think when we got to revisioning psychiatry, we were just a lot more comfortable with interdisciplinarity, and we were influenced a lot by Olive Sporns and networks of the brain. And then the final book, I think, was we really adhered to a kind of thinking that the brain was dynamic and flexible and plastic and embodied and embedded in the environment and all that stuff. So it's just been interesting. Each book, I think, has shown the progression, I think, to this very dynamic model of culture, mind, and brain interactions.
Great, thank you. How do I come back? Oops, I want to come. It says sharing is paused, so I think somebody else did that. So if you can somehow bring it back to my, I can't see my cursor here for some reason. Let me see what I need to do that. I'm screen, now it says I am screen sharing. Okay, good. No, can you see my screen with the 3 books on it? I need some feedback from somebody here, so.
Yes.
Okay, good. It has a weird thing at the top here telling me sharing is paused, so I don't know what to make of that. But anyway, okay, good. Okay, so there are the 3 books, and this is the current book now. And actually, since we have the cover in front of us, I don't know if Rob, if you're there, because you're back to your picture, maybe you're having a snack somewhere. So
No,
if you are there, please tell us about this picture, because it has a very interesting story. So.
Are you talking about the picture on the current
Cover? Yeah, and this is precious artwork, and so knowing the history will be very.
But I don't see it here.
You don't see it.
I see the 3 previous books.
Okay,
Not showing.
so it says not. So that is this problem with that it's not sharing. So what do I need to do? I can't get my cursor there. Let me see what else I can do here. Sorry, your screen sharing. You can see it now.
Yeah.
I'm going to try to see if I can view it in there's a way now to, instead of full screen, because I think when I go full screen, something funny is happening. So I'm just going to make it as big as I can like this, and we'll just do it this way for now. Let's see. Fit slide. There we go. That's almost as good. So there you go. Yeah, please.
Yeah, so this painting is drawn from a much larger collection of paintings that were collected by Margaret Mead and Gregory Bateson in the mid-30s in Bali. You know, Mead and Bateson were looking at this question, actually quite relevant to the methods and approaches are obviously very different, but quite relevant to some of the things we've done, because they were interested in the relationship of child socialization to the propensity to develop mental illness later on. And in fact, their 1935 expedition to Indonesia, what is now Indonesia, was funded by the Scottish Rights Foundation for the study of dementia praecox. It was an early funder of research in mental illness, and specifically in schizophrenia. And so as part of this very wide-ranging and elegant and visual ethnographic work, they went to several different villages. For anyone who's been to Bali, that artistic production is centered in specific villages. There would be a village for stone carving and a village for kind of pointillism color painting. And Mead and Bateson bought about 1,500 paintings for $1 each from these artists, a number of whom went on to be quite famous. In fact, some of the most famous artists in Indonesia. And long story short, the paintings sat beneath Margaret Mead's desk at the Museum of Natural History in New York for a number of years. And then upon her death, they went to and then upon the death of her now divorced husband, Gregory Bateson, they went to Bateson's 4th wife, Lois Bateson. And I just happened to be friends with the daughter of that marriage, not of Mead and Bateson, but of Bateson and his 4th wife, Nora Bateson. And I asked her, this is about 10 years ago. I said, whatever happened to those paintings? She said, well, most of them were sold off, but about 700 from Batuan, which is the main painting village in central Bali, we've held on to, and we're going to sell them on the open market. And it's really a pity because it'll be broken up. So I said, well, you give me a really good price and I will buy that collection. So I have all these paintings. And so for the purposes of this book, I should say, before COVID happened, we were going to do a major exhibition at the Pacific Asian Museum of Art in Pasadena, and it's still being planned for next spring. We're going to do a whole exhibition on kind of the history of anthropology in Bali, and most particularly the history of this collection, which has been termed by my colleague Adrian Vickers as like the preeminent early modern Balinese art collection. So for the purposes of this book, we went through the paintings and we picked one. And what's going on in this painting? Let me look at it. Well, there's obviously a cockfight. You can see that in the middle. And then there's a up to the left, there's a Hindu padanda, a priest giving offerings before the cockfight. There's people selling satay. I'm just looking at that. There's people selling. It's a marketplace with a cockfight, and then surrounded by imagery of Balinese agriculture. But the collection itself is really, really remarkable. And if anyone's really interested in this, Hilly Geertz wrote 3 books on this collection, where she went back and interviewed these painters, many of whom were still alive in the early to mid 80s when she did that piece of her field work. And her book, highly recommended. In fact, it's one of the best straightforward ethnographies of Bali, called Images of Power, Paintings from the Margaret Mead and Gregory Bateson collection. That came out maybe 25 years ago. And she subsequently wrote 2 other books, the most recent of which was just kind of her magnum opus on Balinese storytelling, that's the title, Balinese Storytelling, as seen through the imagery in these paintings. Yeah, so that's the brief history of this collection.
Thank you. The benefit of this Zoom conference is you're getting all the hidden backstory and things to tell your grandchildren. Okay. So the book begins with 3 epigraphs that also represent the 3 broad sort of fields or perspectives we're trying to bring together. The first is from the Nobel Prize winner Albert Szent-Györgyi, which I think invokes sort of evolutionary biology in a way, and arguing implicitly that there's a kind of structure to the brain and a kind of implicit epistemology to the brain, basically saying here the human mind was not designed by evolutionary forces for finding truth, it was designed for finding advantage. So the notion that human cognition is shaped by what is adaptive in some ways, and that we can find the contours of that in our studies. The second, a quote from Oliver Sacks, very timely since this documentary is just coming out on him. In this case, this is a neurologist now, but who is talking about the idea that science itself is somehow connected to our own historical and social context, and pointing toward the narrative context of thought. And that's our last quote then is Marcel Proust, again, master of narrative, but who is also invoking the idea of alterity, of cultural otherness as the source of human creativity and the possibility of seeing all the different worlds that we inhabit. So those really stand as kind of leitmotifs for the different strands that we're trying to see come together in the book. And let me just show you the table of contents of the book. So it begins with this chapter that I'll be summarizing today on behalf of my co-authors, that tries to lay out some of the key themes in the book and the issues. And then it has a series of sections, part 1 on some theoretical models, part 2 on applications, and part 1 begins with a discussion of the co-emergence of culture, mind, and brain. And this is a key concept. We'll be coming back to the idea that no one of these kinds of anchor points of our thinking determines all the others. They co-determine each other in some ways, and we have to have theories that allow us to think about that. And you see the different contributors there, beginning with archaeological studies, cognitive archaeological studies of human tool learning and how the brain reflects that human capacity as it evolves and co-evolves over time. And then Shinobu's chapter, on which he gave you a hint of in his talk, and Carol's, which has more to do with trying to get the texture of life into our theories and into our models and practices and our methods, for that matter. And then we have Sean Gallagher's with us. We have a chapter from Sean and from Dan Hutto and their colleagues looking at this enactivist paradigm. I'll be talking a little bit more about that in a moment, but this is the sort of turn toward understanding human thought as fundamentally tied to action, to taking action in the world, to reshaping the world in some way so that it is something that we can thrive in. And then discussions of sort of how cultural practices shape the brain and how the brain in turn brings basic structure to culture. And you see a series of topics there from Maria Jondron and Batya Mesquita and Lisa Feldman Barrett, Shriki Han and George Northoff, and then our own contribution from some colleagues here at McGill, specifically on this question of agency and how agency is shaped by culture. And then a section that really is looking at cooperative phenomena, because part of the whole point is that the brain is there to help us to cooperate with each other in complex activities. So how does that emerge? How does the brain constrain that or enable that? And how does cooperative phenomena in turn change the brain? And then the second half of the book is really a series of shorter essays that look at the relevance of this kind of thinking and other emerging ideas in neuroscience and in anthropology for our thinking about culture, mind, and brain interactions. And we have a whole series of applications here. And again, some of the contributors, several of them are online with us right now, and I hope we'll be hearing from each of them in the months to come as they sort of revisit the topics that they've presented here. It's very much a selection. It's by no means comprehensive. As you know, the neuro kind of neuro as a prefix, neuro hyphen whatever, has been attached to virtually everything under the sun in recent years. So there are ways of coming at things like aesthetics or like politics or like economics from a neuro angle. What's distinctive, I think, in these contributions is they're looking at it in a bidirectional way in general, that it's not simply how does the brain constrain or make possible our social and cultural experience, but in turn, how does that social and cultural world shape the brain? That's really part of what we're interested in. So it looks like I didn't put in the title page for our first chapter, which I probably should have put here, but in any event, I'll just use this thing to represent that. So I'm going to talk a little bit now for maybe about 20 minutes or so about this first chapter on co-constructing culture, mind, and brain, which is meant to lay out some of the concerns and questions and perhaps give a bit of a framework with which to approach some of the contributions. I should qualify by saying that the authors did not have, the contributors did not have this chapter as an anchor point. All they had was a few bullet points that we provided to people. So the contributors have gone very much in their own directions. It's not like they're necessarily interacting with the framework I'm going to lay out, although I think there has been that interaction in many ways, including the fact that all of us, myself and all the co-authors, have been reading many of the people who are present in this book. So we are in conversation, even though sequentially it may not have been that we wrote this framework and that people sort of responded to it, but rather it's something that we're sort of weaving together here. But I want to lay those ideas out also with the hope that the later talks that you hear from different people will summarize some of their chapter, but go beyond it and to continue this discussion. And we're going to try to encourage everybody to have a look at that first chapter, to have a look at some of the other contributions in the book, so that their talks will be in continued dialogue with the book and be adding something significant to it. So one of the things behind this whole discussion of major concerns is the conviction that although the brain seems like something very material, something we can study in a very rigorous way, scientifically measure its functioning and so on. And when people contrast that with things like social processes, that it sometimes seems to some people that we're moving from the concrete to the more abstract, that in a sense, it's all very concrete, it's all very material, that we live in a hierarchically structured world, that the brain itself is made up of components on different scales, that those components are wired together and function as an integral whole in ways that lead to new properties, new possibilities, new kinds of functioning. That's why we have a notion of brain function. It's why we have psychology. It's why we have the capacities that we have, and that process of building up a complex organ system, functional system of the brain out of neurons and neuroglia, and those in turn of having axons and having dendrites and having synapses, that basic biological hierarchy, which is central to the biological sciences, in which people have techniques for studying it, these biological structures at different scales and different temporal intervals, that material hierarchy that, as I say, is central to our thinking about biology, doesn't stop at the level of the brain or the skull. That the brain is housed within a body, and the body itself has a materiality and has all kinds of consequences for what the brain does. This is the whole basic idea in activism at the level of thinking about motor function, that a lot of the kinds of computations that the brain does about physical action are shaped by the idea that the brain is working with and through a body that has constraints, and that certain things don't have to be thought about abstractly because they're present in the very way that the body works, and they are going to shape the kinds of computations, the kinds of figuring things out that the brain might be engaged in. And similarly, that beyond the body, we are embedded in a social world that is physical, that is material, that is structured at different scales of time and space, in terms of intimate social groups, in terms of larger social groups, in terms of widespread networks of whole societies, and indeed now of global networks. And again, the insistence of this hierarchy, which is very familiar to us from many different kinds of discussions. In medical school, this is presented as sort of part of the biopsychosocial approach. But the key point, and the reason for sort of rehearsing this, is the insistence that this is a material structure all the way up. It doesn't suddenly go from something concrete and measurable to something evanescent and abstract and fictive in some sense. To the contrary, there are structures at each level, and we have vocabularies, we have disciplines that try to take hold of these things, that try to describe their dynamics, to try to discuss their relationships, and we have efforts to link the different levels in this kind of a structured hierarchy in a way that require a detailed understanding. And some of us, some of the people on the call today and so on, are heavily involved with trying to think through this kind of multi-level structure and what kinds of explanation it requires, what kinds of science, in fact, it leads to. So that's the first sort of unifying point through a lot of this discussion. And actually, this is a slide that came out of a conference that Sean Gallagher organized on performance and activism, where there was some debate about the notion of how relevant hierarchy was, in the sense that I've just presented it, and it prompted me to sort of try to outline why I think this notion of hierarchy that I'm talking about is extraordinarily important, and describes a basic fact about the biological world that emerges out of the constraints of evolution. The idea that if you're going to end up with more complex structures, they need to be built out of building blocks in some ways, and we therefore see the hierarchical structure emerging, and we need ways to make sense of that. For human beings, the level at which we live is one of the ones that's most salient, but also most difficult for us to study, because we're immersed in it all the time. So our intersubjective processes, if you approach it from a phenomenological angle, or our sort of physiological interactions and synchrony between each other, if you approach it from a third-person point of view, those processes are fundamental to our everyday experience and to the ways we navigate the world. And for the most part, neuroscience has operated at a level below that. It has not engaged very much in terms of that process, or has looked at it, those social processes, whether they're the intimate social processes of an important relationship, like with a spouse or with a child, or the more distant social structural relationships, is tended to approach those strictly as factors that influence the brain. If you grow up in impoverished circumstances, or if you experience trauma or neglect or something, that can be described in some ways as a single factor that's impacting on the brain, versus the notion that what's happening with any of those kinds of events, with any of those kinds of changes in your life world, is a whole configuration of circumstances and challenges that you somehow are engaging with in an ongoing way, and that we need a more dynamic characterization of that. And we're just beginning to have the tools to begin to look at that by looking at these interactions in a more fine-grained way. First of all, by typifying them in a more fine-grained way, by bringing in methodologies that come from family systems studies, or from other kinds of examinations of interpersonal interaction, but then bringing to that a kind of neuroscience that understands the brain not as operating in isolation, but as depending on interactions with others. And so here's just we chose one particular study of many and of a whole emerging body of work on interactional kind of neuroscience, we could call it, that uses things like hyperscanning, scanning more than one person at a time in some kind of interaction to look at what's happening, not just within brains, but between brains in some sense, and finding the right languages to describe this. So we're using this as the illustration of a general set of issues. And even though this is immensely complicated work, the argument for why this is worth it and important to try to develop is not only that it's interesting and that it's clearly pointing toward things that matter to us and that are central to our functioning, but also the possibility, as we'll argue in a moment, that if this is what the brain evolved for, it evolved to help us, a human brain at least, to navigate and adapt and respond to social worlds, then we're going to get a much clearer sense of how the brain works, how the human brain works, and how things can go wrong if we deal with those kinds of more ecologically real and meaningful situations than the simpler ones that are easier to sort of instantiate in the laboratory. So that's one of the overall interests. And I've already alluded to the fact that insofar as there's sort of a meeting point of different perspectives that can provide us with some theoretical tools and frameworks to advance this work, it comes from this collection of ideas that have been sort of flying under the rubric of what's sometimes called 4E cognitive science now, that stands for embodied, embedded, enacted, and extended. And the idea is that cognition, rather than simply being a computation that occurs in the brain as a kind of abstract general purpose computational system, reflects the fact that we are embodied beings. We have a physicality and all kinds of demands and constraints and possibilities that that confers, that it always occurs in some kind of social context. Even Robinson Crusoe on an island somewhere is populated by all the people that he's known in the past and all the imagination and aspirations he might have about the future, which are deeply social. But in everyday life, of course, most of us are living in constant ongoing interaction with each other. That interaction is not simply the passive reception of things that we're then making sense of, but activities that we are deeply engaged with, and that we engage with, moreover, in ways that sometimes include conscious plans, but to a large extent include responding to things that are presented to us. And so the idea of habitus that Shinobu introduced is not only about the ordinary agency, the naive folk psychological idea of agency as something that originates somewhere and behind our foreheads that we choose a plan, but it's also about the ways we participate in social systems that present to us certain options that move us in certain directions, which we can resist or which we can go with, and that's how we have to understand human action in some ways. And finally, the notion that if you take seriously all of that, then the location of mind, the location of psychological, mental processes, cognition itself is not simply within the human skull. It is actually extended into the world, it's distributed. Gregory Bateson made this point many years ago in talking about how when a person uses a tool, in some sense, the mental process is not just in their head, it is in and through the tool, and in fact, in the tool's interaction with the world outside. So we can go further than that, and we can say that that interaction is with other people. So this is the kind of theory that we've been trying to draw from in our own thinking and contribute to in some ways. And one of the things that we've benefited immensely from, I say we, I mean myself and some of the co-authors, but also our group at McGill and others in the CMB network. So part of what we've drawn from is the sort of currently very influential set of theories in neuroscience around the idea, coming from the work of Carl Friston in particular, but others as well, coming from the idea that the brain is essentially a prediction machine, that we are trying to survive a world that's full of all kinds of surprises and challenges. We are trying to anticipate and respond to things as needed, either to adjust our model of the world to make it more accurate, or to act on the world to make it conform better to what we want it to be and what we need it to be. So that basic notion of predictive processing, of active inference, and the constraints on that, framed in terms of the free energy principle, is extremely important, I think, in a lot of contemporary neuroscience work, and there's a lot of efforts to see how different things can be brought into this. Some of our most recent work has been around the idea of bringing the whole notion of narrative under the same umbrella as these general ideas. And behind that is an idea that Shinobu actually wrote about many years ago, the idea following Gibson's work on sensory and perceptual affordances, that we live in a world that is characterized, since we constructed ourselves to a large degree, that's characterized by what we could call cultural affordances. That is, structures and opportunities for action that allow us to carry out particular cultural roles and tasks and skills to enable and enact them. And that the process of learning to be a cultural being is coming to understand how to look at an environment, how to engage with it, how to dispose our attention in that environment, what's noteworthy, what's novel, what can we use as kind of scaffolding, and also in the same process to begin to infer or what can we say, extract from behind those patterns that we see, notions of shared norms and expectations and conventions that we can then use as a scaffolding for more elaborate behavior. So most recently, we've taken that idea and really tried to extend it to thinking about culture fundamentally as a process, not just of learning a bunch of stuff that you then carry around as an individual, which is a very psychologically individualistic way of thinking about what culture is, but characterizing cultural worlds as a process of learning to think through other minds. That is, to be able to count on distributed knowledge, to count on those norms and expectations, to count on the skills and talents and unique kinds of information and positions that different people occupy within this space of cultural affordances to be able to do all the complex things that we do. And we're suggesting that this might end up being a kind of unifying framework within which we can then do the more detailed and specific work that's tied to particular bits of history, that's tied to all of the contingent and idiosyncratic and particular things that shape our contemporary world and enable our capacities. In one sense, this idea is, I think, completely uncontroversial and just fits with a lot of things we're interested in. The added nuance to this is the ability to bring on board the kind of theorizing that's being used in contemporary computational neuroscience to build models about how a neural network or system can come to detect regularities and generate inferences or hypotheses about the world and test them against the world and refine them and so on. And to take that kind of theorizing, which is represented here by these sort of equations, and view it not only as a brain in relation to the world, but as a brain in relation to other brains. So to turn this into a fundamentally social theory that then allows a whole other level of structure. So that's, if you will, a placeholder. By creating this abstract framework that is consistent with contemporary neuroscience and computational theory, we're creating a framework within which there is at least a placeholder for all of the rich specificity of what's studied by ethnographers, by historians, by social scientists who are looking at particular social worlds. And why is this important? Well, it's important because we would argue that the human brain is the organ of culture, that our brain has been shaped by culture on many different time scales. The oldest is phylogenetic, that is to say we evolved a particular kind of especially complicated brain because of the kinds of demands, adaptive demands that our world presented to us. And that world for many tens of thousands of years has been largely a humanly constructed world. So that general evolutionary constraint on the emergence of a complex, many-folded brain has also become a set of more local constraints on human groups and communities learning to adapt to particular niches, particular socially and culturally constructed niches. And this is what's been studied in the context of niche construction within biology and of coevolution. And Shinobu will be presenting many graphic examples of that in his presentation in a few weeks. So those are the two sort of longer time scales. Then we have a time scale that has to do with individual development. So we're born or we begin in utero with a highly plastic brain. We're born with a limited repertoire of skills, and we begin to layer skills, language skills, cognitive skills, motor skills on top of each other over development, always in a particular cultural context that is then reshaping our brains so that we are a skilled inhabitant of a particular cultural world. We will maybe be a little bit more awkward and less well attuned and adapted to a new cultural world, although we retain enough plasticity throughout life to begin to adapt to new worlds, but we'll always see perhaps some traces, whether it's in an accent or a way of carrying oneself or so on, that speak to where we began and what our early developmental history looked like. So that's the ontogenetic or developmental level. And then we have these two other levels that, again, need to be thought about in the same way in relation to the brain as well. One is I'm calling it a biographical level. It has to do, again, with the spans of one's own life, but not strictly in terms of biological developmental processes that are particularly powerfully salient in early years of development, but also through our own narrative capacities. The fact that we then construct models of ourselves, ways of narrating our life, ways of interacting with each other, which then have their own dynamics, but which also change the ways that we think and function, and demonstrably change to some degree the ways our brains function. And finally, what we could call the contextual temporal level, which is the more immediate levels of what kind of situation are we in, what does it demand from us, and what in our repertoire of possibilities are we going to bring forward. So these are the timescales that we think are all interesting, and it's interesting to think about culture and brain interactions and the emergence of mind, mental phenomena and processes within these timescales. And here they are sort of displayed on this kind of logarithmic scale, just to acknowledge that there are big temporal differences, even though these things all overlap, even though they're all important, and even though in a sense you could take any particular human phenomenon, a piece of behavior, a pattern of behavior, a social situation, and analyze it on many of these different kinds of timescales to think about what they mean. So that's a key kind of integrated framework, and Carol will talk more about this in her talk next week as well. One of the, because we're born in a very vulnerable way, because we as infants really require others around us, and we require a very structured environment to survive, there are a lot of things that are built into human capacities that facilitate this early nurturance and structure over the course of the life. And this is just a table that Carol prepared, representing some of the areas of care that provide those circumstances that allow an infant and a child and later in life a human being to survive and to acquire culture as a way of flourishing. So the book, as I say, although this was not a structure that was imposed on people, these timescales are evident in the contributions to the book. And this is a table from the chapter that just sort of shows both the idea that there are some different, although overlapping, mechanisms involved in the different processes of cultural shaping of the brain and the brain shaping of culture. And that there are different chapters in the book that provide more detailed study of particular aspects of this. Because in the end, I'm giving you a very, very general kind of framework. All the really interesting stuff ends up being at the level of very particular histories, of very particular mechanisms. The brain is not a general purpose computer, although it can do that when called upon. It's really, back to Albert Gengorkian, our opening epigraph, it's really an organ designed to help us adapt to very particular kinds of challenges and opportunities. And again, Shinobu will be talking more about this. Carol will be talking about it in another way. The environments that we grow up in are highly structured culturally, and that in turn is shaping who we are in ways, even though we may resist that, we may push back against it, we may transform it through our own actions, we may be mobile and leave it and go to a completely different environment. So all that needs to be taken into account when we're talking about these kinds of interactions. But it does lead us to insist that understanding the brain itself is going to necessarily involve having an ecological understanding of the context in which the brain develops and in which human capacities develop. So these two images just stand for that. This is an image from Bali of terracing and rice fields, and again you can see how highly structured this is, and gives some hint, as Shinobu may talk about, the huge amount of highly organized cooperative behavior necessary to do rice cultivation. And here an image of a field, a wheat field, and this is again a contrast that Shinobu talks about in this chapter, and will perhaps elaborate on, of the differences, historical differences between rice cultivating cultures and wheat cultivating cultures, in a very important paper he did in Science many years ago that shows how, suggests how these cultural differences and practices have an impact on human personality, differences in populations, and ostensibly in differences in the brain. So the conclusion from this framework is that human biology is cultural biology, that we can be very biological, that's fine, but the kind of biology we're talking about is a biology that is about being a cultural being. In turn, though, there is a biology of culture in the sense, and so there's a biology of culture in the way we just talked about. There also is a culture of biology in the sense that the ways we talk about biology at any given point in time reflect cultural values and perspectives, and that's very important for us in the at the end of sort of looking about knowledge translation and the ways we do things, because we're living at a moment in which the brain is really looked to as the thing that's going to explain everything and that is going to account for our commonalities and our uniqueness and so on. And part of what we're trying to do in this book is insist that that's not a complete story, that a complete story is going to have to include history, it's going to have to include geography, it's going to have to include culture in very particular ways. And if we're not including that, if we're assuming from the get-go that we don't need to think about that very much because we've gotten some kind of more basic structure, we should pause for at least a moment and ask what we might be leaving out or what we might be overgeneralizing about. So this is actually my last slide, and it is actually taken not from the first chapter, but from the last chapter. As I mentioned, the last chapter is a discussion of interdisciplinarity. It revisits a little bit the contents of the book, and then it talks a bit about under what circumstances can we really engage in productive conversations across disciplines. And at the bottom is sort of a representation of what the first chapter is trying to invoke, which is this idea of co-construction of culture, mind, and brain. By mind, we don't mean a thing, but we mean certain kinds of processes that are important to us because they have to do with our cognitive capacities and enable us to engage in very complex activities in the world. And that those are instantiated through a whole hierarchy of different kinds of processes, all of which are essential for what we call human cognition and human mental phenomena, and for which we have many different disciplines, each sort of looking at a slice of the process and many different methodologies. And so there really is no choice if you want any kind of an adequate picture. There's no choice to be anything but other than interdisciplinary. And the challenge is really how to do that. The challenge is, first of all, conceptual. How do we put these things together in a way that doesn't jump levels or mistake an analogy for an explanation? But the challenges are also cultural and institutional to the degree that academia is highly disciplinary, that people defend their disciplinary boundaries, that people, as we talked about at the beginning, Rob mentioned at the beginning, people are very quick to detect an interloper, someone who doesn't speak with the requisite level of sophistication or who doesn't have the right pedigree, and those become obstacles to having a deeper conversation in which we can identify a common object of concern and really advance our thinking. So that gives you a little bit of an overview of what's in the book. The book is available today on Amazon, not to turn this into a commercial exactly, but it's available for download, and I think it'll be shipping very soon. And we'll make this brochure available if you can get a discount from Cambridge University Press. I'm not sure how this compares to the price from Amazon. I think it may not be that different in the end, but you can take a look. And I'm going to stop now and stop screen sharing and come back to all of you and all your faces. And maybe we can have a little bit of questions, comments. Maybe we could take a moment if any of the co-editors want to add anything or correct something or balance something, if I kind of went too far off on some tangent. I'll give you a chance to save me from my own biases. Otherwise, I hope we can take a few minutes at least to have some comments, questions, discussion.
Yeah, let's hear from the community there online.
We're all eager to hear your thoughts. And those of you who are here, I mean, please, those of you who are here who are authors and contributors, feel free to speak up. You will have your own podium at some point later in the next few months to speak at length, but anything you'd like to raise now would be very welcome. And those of you who are—
Should people use the raise hands function like
sure,
Veronique is doing currently?
yeah. I can't, somebody has to see that though. I don't see all the hands, but anyway, no hands.
Veronique has a hand raised. Do you want to go ahead?
Yes, Veronique, please.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much, Laurence, and thanks everyone for putting this together. This is really exciting. And I couldn't agree more that cultural contributions cannot be left out. Otherwise, something really important will be missing. And that's the reason why I went from, my background in neuroscience, which was almost exclusive, to looking at cultural differences. And to me, the reason why it was so fundamental was because I was interested in the neuroscience of aging. And if we just look at it in terms of brain, then we're very limited. And when I saw that what we do and cultures can influence our brains and then protect our brains, then that could influence aging and promote cognitive aging, then it changed everything. So, but one thing that came about to me recently, which you touched upon, and that's why I want to raise this, is the importance of context. So all of our lives have completely changed, and you guys are the experts. The way we interact with the world has completely changed in the last few months in a way we've never experienced, right? So what I've seen just from simple observations is that there seems, so it's not just context affecting the brain and interactions, but it's almost as though there's context effect of like influencing specific neural networks. And what I see is that when people interact with Zoom, there are lots of people who are having word finding difficulties, but when they're interacting face to face, the same person, it won't happen. So I wondered whether there's neural pathways that are triggered by context. And we know this from, there's a lot of studies or reports of, for example, addiction, where you get overdoses in certain contexts and not others. So there's a foundation for context influencing biology or triggering networks, like different biological networks, basically. So I was wondering what you thought about this. And it seems like there's a big role, I think, now that cultural psychiatry can play with the current situation to try to help explain or see, how this change will contribute to cognitive changes, basically, or changes in cognition.
Very, very interesting, and absolutely, we're living in a new context that's upended. Even though many of us, even before this, spent too much time in front of our screens, we're in a whole other order of magnitude kind of situation now. And the idea that changes many, many things, and the affordances of a Zoom screen where I'm looking at you like a giant Hollywood squares right now, versus being in a room in a space where certain kinds of conversations have occurred in the past, and where there are certain smells and sounds and all these other sensory cues. This is part of what we mean by cultural affordances, and the idea that a lot of cognition is simplified for us by having a certain set of pre-selected affordances present in the context that we're working in, and that learning how to move across those is a separate skill. And that now we lost, in many cases, many of those cues, and have to learn to navigate in a different way. So I think it's a fascinating set of issues, and it's a little bit below the radar, I think, for many things, although probably it intersects a lot with the concerns people have right now about education online and how well or that can or cannot be conducted for children or for others. So.
But also for aging, right? It's known that socialization will dramatically increase longevity without dementia. Right, every hour of socialization will give years, and now our older adults are isolated. Actually, some of them even chose to die, right? There's stories of people stopping to take their medication, but even for those who didn't. So there's going to be I think a significant impact on cognition, even in the elderly group.
I should mention that the network, the CMB network, has a call from within the network for proposals related to the new normal, which in a way is trying to get us to think again about what environment we embedded in and what's being taken for granted about it that may have all kinds of consequences that we haven't thought through. So
yeah, I want to add just one thought. That's comment is very, very interesting. Maybe sharing similar interest and concern of this new normal. We've been looking into this, what you might call analgesic effect of social relationship. So, there's a famous, fMRI study that shows that your brain's response to electric shock is attenuated if a significant other is holding your hand, right? So I think that kind of effect is real. And well, in my current projects with my students, basically, we try to explain why people do what appears to be reckless behavior when they go to a bar or beaches and so on. So basically we say, okay, social relationship might make them forget fear of COVID temporarily, which may make them behave in a way that doesn't make sense under this kind of condition. But it just occurred to me that absence of negative affects like fear may be very good for cognitive processes. Meaning, conversely, negative arousal may interfere with maybe cortical processing of information. Attention can be very narrowed and fail to take into account broader range of things, and people may become very short-sighted, and all sorts of things can come in to impair cognitive functions. So, unfortunately, parties and bars and those things happen only in very limited occasions for some limited set of individuals. Many of us will never go to those places because, first of all, it seems crazy to go out to have social interaction. So, that's a good news in respects to prevention of COVID-19, but that may have a negative impact on cognition. Just a thought.
Yep. This is one of the, we organized, some of us here organized a few months ago, one of the first talks on these discussion on the new normal. And that's part of the challenge is that, people begin with doing what's prudent from a public health point of view to reduce transmission, but inevitably there are all kinds of trade-offs going on now in terms of, psychological consequences, even morbidity, mortality. So how do we weigh those? How do we weigh those individually? How do we weigh those at a public health level? We don't have enough information even to do it well. So people are sort of navigating their own way based on, their particular dilemmas and some ideologies, including a helping dose of misinformation and disinformation. So. Yeah. Other people who'd like to make a comment or question or raise another issue? Please, this is your big chance. We may not have this particular configuration together for a while. This is Zoom fatigue or Zoom paralysis or kind of bystander effect. Nobody feels really called upon now to speak. So.
Yeah, I want to ask one question. For a variety of reasons, especially in the United States, failure of administration to do anything just made the current situation so miserable, and no end is in sight, absolutely. Now, that has created lots of problems in doing research. You just cannot go to, especially for cultural researchers, and also even more cultural researchers who want to use brain indicators of some sort. Right? I mean, many of you may want to use a scanner or something, and hopefully investigate, people with different cultural background or social background. And it requires really intensive research, or maybe you may want to go somewhere to do some interviews, and all this became extremely hard. And I'm curious what your ideas might be to move forward. I initially thought, okay, let's wait until the fall. And maybe by that time, we might be able to start, just a research as usual. No, that's not true. And now we are kind of forced to explore alternative ways of getting things done. I mean, trying to find something. So I'm curious.
Yeah, Rob.
Yeah, from a fieldwork perspective, Shinobu, for me, because I've been able to continue my work because I've spent years collaborating with people in Indonesia. And so I can't obviously get on a plane and go to Java, but I have colleagues there who can, who I've worked with now for 20 years. And they can gather whatever I need to get, and we can collaborate on it. So I think we are an interconnected world, and with the digital revolution and good interpersonal collaborations, you can still get a lot accomplished. I mean, it'd be better if I went there myself and did the work, but not that much better. And in some ways, particularly the sort of work I do now in visual anthropology, not having a white face in a village when we're shooting something is actually a positive. So me not being there, not kind of throwing that into the mix, this outsider, this foreigner doing the work, as regardless, even with people, my participants or subjects who I've known for years, it's still better to have local people do that sort of work. So I think there are upsides to this if we have established those relationships.
I was having a discussion earlier today with Michael Lifshitz exactly around, some of these issues around what kind of research can and can't be done in this setting. And one of the things that occurred to us was because of everybody now being reduced to this lowest common denominator of Zoom, maybe it's an opportunity to get around the sort of weird subjects problem in psychology, because so much, as you know, so much psychology is done on, undergraduate students who have to get some credit for their course or just a captive audience. And it's put all these biases in studies. Now we can get people from all over the world, from different walks of life and whatever. I mean, there's potential. If the things we can do can be done online and done through interaction or conversation or whatever, we could actually have certain kinds of samples that might be, they'll have their own distortions, but they'll be more representative in some respects. So that's one small, plus the fact that as Veronique's saying, we have to study this predicament itself. So there's, in that case, fine, we're working with what we have to make sense of it. But we need
I'm
to
very
work
much inclined to
go ahead,
agree
Maxwell.
with you. Yeah, I'm very much inclined to agree with you, Laurence. I think one of the things that we can do is to really leverage the network structure that we've established over the last several years to I mean, not all of us are subject to the same constraints everywhere. So one of the things that we've been trying to do, for example, is collect data where data collection is doable, and to coordinate more is like one integrated lab, leveraging the resources that are available, given the kind of shifting regulations and the uncertain policy landscape. So as it evolves over the next few years. So.
I mean, I have to say, for me, the networking possibility is one of the only virtues of the current situation. It's much easier to schedule a meeting with people than it ever was, because everybody's living in Zoom half the time, so we can just pull a group of people together. So that's nice, and it's no great substitute for real social life.
But what I mean concretely is that, for example, I'm working in collaboration with some people at McGill and Oxford, with a slightly wider network involving, for example, researchers in Hong Kong, who were differently affected by these confinement regulations and whose data collection wasn't necessarily interrupted in the same kind of radical way that ours was in North America broadly. And this is what I mean, is that we're not all subject geographically to the same levels and kinds of constraint. And if we coordinate more heavily in terms of who collects the data and who analyzes the data, then we can really like leverage this kind of predicament, which, as you point out, is like, well, now we're all kind of stuck in hyperspace. Well, you know, we might as well leverage the fact that we're stuck in hyperspace to hyper coordinate in hyperspace, you know, and act in this kind of distributed fashion.
Sounds good.
I just have a small comment. I hear from my colleagues who are working with Zoom to collect data that you need to plan for a budget for the participants because they came back with the bills and they couldn't afford the Zoom bills that they got or whatever internet bills that they were getting. So, and then the research participant said, I don't have a budget for this. What do I do?
Oh, really? So that's very interesting. So when you use your Zoom account, right, university has a Zoom subscription of some sort. And still, subjects on the other side of the globe have to pay something?
Not to Zoom,
Well,
but
they have to have internet. They have to have internet.
Oh, internet.
When they were tested by, I think they have a Zoom Health that's confidential or something, but then the internet costs were high and they didn't have like an internet plan that allowed, you know, these like the bandwidth, you know, that they needed.
Interesting. I didn't think about that. Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, it remains, that's right, that we still have a digital divide that access the internet, although it's widespread and through cell phones, people have at least a little bit in terms of being able to have a Zoom thing with 30 people on it. I mean, that you need a certain bandwidth and so on. And we have this experience in Canada working with Indigenous communities. We have a mental health promotion program and we're trying to provide all kinds of stuff over the internet, but many communities are not set up to be able to have that kind of easy exchange. Those of us who are in academic centers or whatever and have a fiber optic, you know, pathway to the backbone. So I think that's an important reminder again that the economic inequities, and we know that's one thing that's been happening, is that this thing that for those of us who already work online is not such a huge segue, that part of our lives. But for many people, this is really aggravating economic inequalities because they don't have access or because they have to juggle multiple things, some, you know, childcare and finding a few minutes to talk online or whatever. So.
In some ways, this, I think this is just requiring us to do what we knew we should have been doing all along. So one aspect is the decolonization of science. Sorry, I can turn on my video. The decolonization of science, which has been remarked upon for at least 20 years more and more acutely. The other is the kind of resource barriers that stand in the way of that. But the other is forcing, as Maxwell was saying, a sort of much more collaborative approach where we actually listen to our collaborators in remote places who have different ideas and different constraints. And I think science does much better when you put serious constraints on it. And we've had the luxury of just wallowing around in all kinds of great resources. It focuses the mind wonderfully when you have to try to do better with less. So weirdly, I think, yeah, I think there are some real virtues and possibilities for positive change.
We have 1 minute left in our official time. Last comment or question or reflection?
Well, Carol's point is very well taken, but you know, neuroscience, it's hard because you have to have money to have your machine, run those machines to even get data. So I think, Laurence, you're right. I mean, psychology is very bad. 95% made in the United States or Canada or Western Europe. But neuroscience for sure is worse because it's just impossible to do anything despite all the good intentions in Africa, for example, because no scanner.
Well, wait. Gates Foundation has developed a machine that there is at $75,000 now. You can plug it into the wall. So, the issue with scanners is power supply and expense. And they say they're pushing it down to 50,000. So that's still serious money, but it's serious portability. In other words, if you're really constrained and you really have to, figure out how to do it, then I think, this will be wonderful.
Oh yeah, wonderful. I completely agree. When it's very hard, that's when, payoff can be very high if you can pull it off in some way. But, it's still hard, it seems to me. And another problem I can see is that, all those fields are Western dominated, meaning that each one of us can easily be taking up the role of a leader of the project, almost unintentionally imposing our views on those people who don't have Western education and wonderful skill of argumentation and systematic presentation of ideas and all this. And I'm kind of in bind because once you start listening to people, it doesn't go anywhere, just at least as quickly. So I feel tempted to organize a project while being fully mindful of unwanted possibility that this may be a form of Christian missionary who's imposing their views on people in the colonies.
We have this all the time in working with Indigenous communities, and again in Canada, where this has been highly politicized, and people are very clear that there's a kind of epistemic injustice in which they've been viewed as having no knowledge worth contributing, and they'll be the docile subjects of our so people are pushing back against that very heavily. And there's this whole movement within the APA even of Indigenous psychology, of people trying to say, what happens if we start from a different set of premises? Can we get a different theory? So I think in principle, the possibility of having these conversations and using some of the tools and using some of the rigor that already exists, but really testing alternate hypotheses, I think it's really something that's emerging, and it's going to lead to a lot of exciting work, I think, over the next few decades. The only concern I have about sort of taking on the constraints you're describing, Carol, is that in general, because things are hard, people do what seems feasible and what seems practical, and that in turn is shaped by various agendas. So I think it's why the kind of framework we're trying to put out in this book that insists on including certain things, if that's there at the beginning, then one won't just do the easy thing, and one won't just look under the lamppost because that's where the light is, and that has to be there, because otherwise most normal science, in Kuhnian terms, is just doing what you can do with existing tools, and let's just find something that's a low-hanging fruit and we'll do some of that. And there has to be some pushback where people say, but we want to study a real world phenomena, or we want to capture a little bit more of what's going on here, and we'll have to be creative about that to do it. So that's a segue to your talk next, believe it or not, to your talk next week. So look, we're probably just getting started here, but this is the first of many talks. So I hope most of you will come back next week. They won't always be every week, they'll be spaced out more, but it just happens in terms of scheduling that we're able, I think, to follow up right away with a talk that will be based on one of the first few chapters in the book, and that will be Carol's. And a few weeks after that, we'll have Shinobu's talk, and then we'll be working through some of the other ones. I want to thank all of you for being here. It's been tremendously for me anyway, tremendously interesting and enjoyable, and I hope it was rewarding for you. And I want to thank all the authors and contributors and my co-editors and the FPR and Irene and Rob and Connie and Mamie and all the people who've sort of made this whole journey possible that we're still on. Yeah, I don't know if anybody else wants to say some last words. Those are my last words for today.
Thank you.
I just wanted, can I say something? I wanted
Please.
to thank you, Laurence, for your incredible, amazing leadership all these years and direction. It's incredible, really.
Thank you, Connie. That's exactly why I asked if somebody else wanted to say something. I was hoping that you'd somebody.
Yeah, we emailed beforehand. No. But Laurence, I mean, we're all here because of you. You're just, thank you.
You're very kind. I think we're all here because of each other. We're all here because of you, and because of Rob, and because of Irene and Mamie, and yeah. But anyway, yes, thank you. It's very rewarding. I have to say, for all the stripped down nature of sociality through Zoom, it's definitely rewarding to have, to come together for a few minutes like this. So.
Oh, I'm sorry. And Shinobu and Carol and Rob, it's a dream team of co-editors. And I'm very sad this project is over. So.
Well, we'll do another project.
Yeah.
Okay, so please go have dinner or walk outside or breakfast or wherever you are in the world, and to be continued.
Thank you.